This is the Open Society Hub for Politics of the Anthropocene. Another seminar with a brilliant speaker coming from abroad. This is what we do. We bring here best minds and discuss their work. And also trying to produce our own work that will be on par with these presentations. Professor Peter van Dam from the University of Amsterdam. Peter is professor of Dutch history, who increasingly specializes on environmental history and the political antecedents and implications of climate change. He is also interested in not only in energy, as we all do, but also in food issues. And he has just published a book with Cambridge University Press on fair trade, which is a particular Dutch approach to humanitarianism. The title of the book is Fair Trade, Humanitarianism in the Age of Post-Colonial Globalization. Peter also coordinates the research group, which is a counterpart of ours. The research group is called Environment and Society, Contestation and Governance in the University of Amsterdam. Peter is also a co-founder of an enigmatic institute called SEVEN, which is the University of Amsterdam Climate Institute. And we have, Peter has recently submitted a chapter for our forthcoming volume called The Tragedy of the Greens, Comparative Politics of Green Parties Across Europe, about the history and politics of the green movements and parties in the Netherlands. And we have many more plans of working together. So welcome, Peter, and looking forward to your work.
Thank you. Thank you. Not talking about fair trade, but we can do that over drinks, I think, afterwards if anybody wants to. Today. But thanks, Alexander. Thanks, Ipos, for having me, and to you all for taking your time, maybe some people at home even. What I do want to talk about is about the great acceleration within the larger Anthropocene narrative, and then the specific place of resistance against or attempts to slow down the great acceleration. Now, that so-called great acceleration marks, I think, a crucial moment in the history of the longer history of the Anthropocene. Over the course of the Great Acceleration, which starts roughly after the Second World War, no place on this planet we can visit today has not been touched by the steep increase of production, transportation, and consumption that it denotes. Every place, however, I think is part of this history in a very particular own way, and understanding these diverging trajectories is essential to historical analysis and also to the contemporary politics of the Anthropocene. So we're going to zoom in on a specific place, and it won't surprise you, given my title, that is the Netherlands. The country from which I traveled here last night, the Netherlands, might be the quintessential place to think about the causes and the consequences of the Anthropocene. All of its landscapes have evidently been formed by interactions between humans and the environment. This development, of course, predates the 20th century, but the scale was markedly increased during that 20th century. The image you're seeing here shows the construction of the last phase of the so-called Zuiderzeewerken, the Zuiderzee waterworks, which commenced in 1919. These waterworks converted the former Zuiderzee into an enormous sweetwater lake by creating a dam that was closing it off from the sea arm, and then the sweetwater feeding in it became, over the course of about 20 years, became a sweetwater lake instead of a sea. These waterworks secured the people living on the edges of that former sea from floodings that were happening regularly before the closing off in 1919. And a series of polders that were created in the course of damming the sea area provided new agricultural land and space to build new cities. So a couple of the largest cities in the Netherlands are actually on land that was reclaimed is a strange word that is always used here, during those waterworks. These waterworks, the Zuiderzeewerken, contributed considerably to the Netherlands' ability to become one of the primary global players in the global agricultural industry today. Now, this is, I would say, the Anthropocene in full swing on a very local scale. In places like these, we can see what the era of humans as geological actors actually looks like. And here we all but have to question the distinction between humans and nature. That's the Anthropocene challenges us to question. At the time these waterworks were completed, or 30 years after they started in 1919, the Great Acceleration had taken off. The vast expansion of the scale at which humans produced, transported, and consumed is first and foremost knowable as a series of steep inclines and graphs monitoring anything from the tons of fish that people have caught over different years and the tons of carbon dioxide emitted and so much more. I think we all are aware of the Stephan's team's graphs about how the Earth systems are changing. And as such, this great acceleration is a key development in the longer history of the Anthropocene. Many processes which undermine the stability of the climates today had taken root before the Second World War, of course, but since the Second World War, they sped up and rapidly undermined the conditions under which humans and other species were used to living. The grand narrative of the Great Acceleration comes at a historiographical cost, however, I would argue. It fails to explain what actually drove these processes. Who was catching more fish? Who was actually emitting more carbon dioxide? The aggregate numbers tell us nothing of the instances where people actually found ways to avoid crossing planetary boundaries, or at least to try to do so. The unstoppable trend upward suggests a situation beyond human control. That way, the Great Acceleration narrative threatens to depoliticize the past. Resistance, or slightly broader, the different possible decisions about the way to relate to the environment fade into the background. That by way of the sort of prelude. Now, the car, I argue, is the perfect prism to begin to sketch out a history of politics, the politics of the environment in the era of the Great Acceleration. So a history that repoliticizes that history of the Great Acceleration. This advertisement for one of the Dutch-built cars in the post-war years provides actually most of the cues to how we can do that all at once. It speaks of the aspirations of increased prosperity and the aspirations of increased mobility. It speaks about health, and it speaks about safety if we look at the way people are sitting and conducting themselves in the car. It speaks of the transformation of the landscape. They're driving a road straight through the coastal landscape, and it's actually very hard to imagine this being a Dutch landscape, but that's a different, it looks much more like England than any place in the Netherlands I could imagine, but it is pictured or idealized to be the Netherlands. And we, of course, also know about the environmental consequences of the car and the lifestyle that it stood for. At the same time, and I think that's also very intriguing about this picture, the advertisement points out how this lifestyle introduced a desire to connect to the world outdoors. Right? This is very much also a picture of going out into the country, of connecting to nature by using the car. And finally, the advertisement's striking gender stereotypes, man behind the wheel, two children in the back, and of course, a woman sitting happily next to the driver. That way of picturing gender hierarchies that we wouldn't see in most car advertisements today also remind us that both the cultural and the material conditions have not remained unaltered during the era of the Great Anthropocene. So this is an earlier moment of the Great Acceleration than we are experiencing right now. Histories of the climate crisis have understandably foregrounded the missed chances and the global attempts to address climate change, so the attempts to address climate change through international global governance. I will instead take my cue from a very particular place, the Netherlands, and highlight many successful challenges to the Great Acceleration. And in doing so, I'm actually taking up a line of thinking which has important roots here in Vienna, harking back to Kropolani's work on market society and the idea that he articulates there in the idea of a double movement through which market society sought to protect themselves from the negative impacts of modern markets. In relation to the politics of the environment, Michael Best has pointed out how France became a light green society over the course of the second half of the 20th century in reaction to, or as a reaction to environmentalist challenges of prevailing policies. I want to take that line of reasoning, Polanyi and Michael Best, one step further today, focusing on how the emergence of the car and its consequences were contested from the start. I hope to show that resistance and an environmental consciousness have been present right from the start of the Great Acceleration, and that have exerted an influence on the trajectory of the Great Acceleration right from the start. So rather than pitting environmentalist positions against those promoting the practices that caused the Great Acceleration, I want to show how the Great Acceleration unfolded despite widely shared environmental concerns and brought discussions about how to mitigate environmental degradation. To do so, and here I'm taking up something that is also part of the chapter that I've submitted about the tragedy of the Greens, I will first redefine what I see as environmental politics, or define what I see as environmental politics, and it's slightly different from general historiography. So important to stress that because historical analyses of environmental activism in the global north have usually aligned themselves with the self-image of the new social movements which emerged around environmental issues in the 1970s. The purported singularity of environmental issues and their relation to post-material positions exclude some of the most pressing environmental issues, such as access to resources and health. So these are issues that, to put it very bluntly, organizations like Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth haven't stressed as much. And we see, I think, in historiography on post-war environmentalism, a similar neglect of these kind of crucial, very crucial environmental subjects as things that are not part of histories of environmentalism to the extent that maybe they should be. Because in relation to environmentalism in the global south, scholarship has foregrounded the importance of exactly those material issues, health and access to resources. And I'm not convinced that a division between the global south and north along the lines of material and material environmental interests is actually warranted. Instead, I propose to use the same lens for environmental politics wherever we study them. And this means that my research on environmental initiatives includes a wide array of attempts to change the way people related to the environment, including those by organizations which labeled themselves environmentalist or green, but also many other groups that challenge those same relations. What I'm presenting today are insights from recent research on initiatives promoting sustainability, mostly in the Netherlands, and mostly around issues of consumption, energy, and car use. I'm not going to talk much about food today. Once again, we can do that during the questions or afterwards. Let's explore how this perspective on environmental initiatives actually plays out. The car evoked environmental concerns from the moment it arrived. In the Netherlands, a broad array of civic groups and policymakers attempted, often successfully, to curb the use of cars. Around the car, key environmental concerns of the post-war era come to the fore, and that's why I think it's such a great prism, because I think most of the main concerns about environmental problems are coming to the fore around cars. I'm not saying cars are the main problem, just saying it's a useful prism, right? I mean, the first one is the transformation of landscapes. Second one, the limited availability of resources. And the final one, pollution. And the focus on the Netherlands is instructive in more than one regard. Here is a country which is comprehensively shaped, as I just showed you, by the interplay between humans and the environment. A transnational node for production and consumption in that global system of production and consumption that is emerging in the post-war era. And also very much a place where ideas and civic initiatives also circulate quite strongly transnationally. So also a place where a lot of different civic initiatives actually come together. It's no coincidence, for example, the Greenpeace archives are now in Amsterdam. So there's a way in which also the Netherlands often serve as a node for different campaigns. The Netherlands are a prime example of post-war petroculture. And that is, I think, a final really important point on many levels. The government and oil companies have maintained very close relations, even venturing to extract natural gas from the Groningen gas field together. Its citizens drew the benefit of fossil fuel extraction through private comfort and welfare state arrangements financed by the profits made on that gas extraction. And here's a country deeply implicated in bringing about and attempting to curb the Great Acceleration. Let's start with the attempts to curb the effects on the transformation of the environment. As I mentioned, the Great Acceleration has really left no landscape untouched, and the car played a very important role in this transformation, particularly, of course, in Western Europe. And if we look at the Netherlands in the year 1950, just to give you a couple of numbers to gauge the impact a little bit, there were in the Netherlands 121 kilometers of highway in the Netherlands. So 121, it's a small country, right? 25 years later, 1975, it was 10 times that, 1,529. The countryside, villages, and cities were transformed, you could also say destroyed, to improve their accessibility by car. And it's a very quick, very comprehensive transformation of the landscape as the construction of this highway close to between Amsterdam and Utrecht, where you can really see how the landscape, and nowadays if you go to Amsterdam, you'll probably drive over this highway. And this transformation of the landscape met with considerable resistance, particularly in relation to areas considered of particular natural value and the old city centers. Policymakers in the Netherlands soon started to explore ways to integrate the car in the urban and the rural fabric more smoothly. So this is really kind of still a full-on attack on the landscape, but what happens then is a shift. And two initiatives by the Amsterdam Prof group illustrate the main lines of criticism and also the kind of solutions that are proposed to account for the prevailing resistance. The Prof group drew a lot of attention in Amsterdam since 1965. Anybody who's studied protest movements in the post-war era has probably come across one or two of their campaigns because they're transnationally very influential. With provocative action, very, very briefly summarizing their agenda, its members managed to attract a lot of attention from the police, from local inhabitants, as well as national and international media outlets. And one of its most famous campaigns, this one here on the left, was launched in the summer of 1965. Gathering in the heart of the city, at the Spuy Square, the group read out a so-called charge of murder for all car drivers, while other members painted 3 bicycles white. And this was the launch of the so-called White Bicycle Plan, which called for the distribution of unlocked white bicycles throughout the city for public use. So you should take it, drive it somewhere, ride it somewhere, leave it, and somebody else could take it again, right? It's a kind of the idealized version of the car sharing that we see nowadays. The White Bicycle Plan was aimed against private property and the use of cars in the city, creating a safer and a less polluted city, and also one that was less invested in a form of private capitalism. The campaign resonated with the main anxieties invoked by the Great Acceleration: the excesses of private consumption, the crowding of cities, and the environmental effects of rapidly increasing production and consumption. Now, the Prof group disbanded in 1967, but through the new Kabouter Gnome movement, so there's always a very playful acting and kind of the naming and also a kind of constant back and forth on whether these initiatives are meant as only symbolic acts or actually also meant to last, right, and have an actual societal impact. Is even in the naming. Council member Luut Schimmelpenninck, who was one of the original members of the Prof group and then went on to dabble in municipal politics in Amsterdam, pioneered plans in the early 1970s to introduce a small electric car, which anyone could use by becoming a member of the corresponding cooperative organization. And this is the wit car, the white car. It's the one on the right. It was first seen driving through the streets of Amsterdam already in 1968, a prototype, and then from the 1970s, you would really regularly see those driving. So it's one of those kind of things that we remember as a utopian project, but it was also really part of the fabric of the city during the 70s. By the time the first 4 of the charging stations for the WIT car were in operation in 1974, so there's really then 4 charging stations at 4 locations in the city where you could get one of those cars and bring it back so that it could be reloaded, the public outlook on environmental issues had notably shifted. The Limits to Growth report, published in 1972, and the oil crisis in 1973 had fostered widespread support for environmental policies which would further curb pollution, but, and probably even more importantly, in reaction to the 72-73 moment, promote the preservation of resources. At this time, almost all of the political parties in the Netherlands supported measures to reduce industrial pollution, use energy and resources more efficiently, and to discourage citizens from using their cars privately. So this is really not, although this is kind of the spearhead of it, there's really a widespread acknowledgement that this is the way to go. Maybe not the specific car here, because that has always been very contested, but really kind of the thing it stood for was widely acknowledged. Yeah, exactly. The 1973 oil crisis had painfully displayed the Dutch dependence on oil. In the wake of the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East, the OPEC countries announced that they would decrease their oil deliveries to countries supporting Israel. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq additionally announced an all-out boycott of the Netherlands because of their direct support to Israel. The Netherlands was seen as a particularly staunch supporter of Israel, and for that reason singled out as one of the countries that would really be all-out boycotted, although it was completely unclear how that would play out because nobody knew how it would be established that the oil leaving one of those countries would actually not go to the Netherlands, because of course there's the companies that serve as intermediaries are not very clear about that usually. One of the things that makes fair trade for oil such a hard topic. Now it was hard from the perspective of the Dutch government to gauge the consequences of these announcements and of these threats. The Dutch government opted for a preemptive policy of saving as much fuel as possible. On 30 October 1973, it announced the introduction of car-free Sundays. And this is actually the book project that I'm working on right now. A longer history of that idea of limiting, curbing consumption by curbing everyday rhythms. On a car-free Sunday, car owners were not allowed to use their vehicles unless they had been granted an exception. And they commenced just days after the announcement. So really, this is the 30th of October is the announcement. I think 4 days after that, you already had to have the first, we had the first car-free Sunday in the Netherlands. And not just here, it was widespread in Europe, that the idea that you could use a car-free Sunday as a way to save oil. This measure was highly controversial in the Netherlands in 1973, underlining the extent to which the country had become a petroculture by that time. Because actually, there had been car-free Sundays since 1939, repeatedly in the Netherlands, but this was the first time that there was really full-on resistance to that idea that this was a justifiable measure given the situation. And the Dutch government eventually opted to replace the car-free Sunday with a different system to save oil, namely fuel rationing, which had been the preferred policy choice in the United States, for example. From January 1974, instead of car-free Sundays, individuals could decide how best to use the liters of gasoline of fuel allocated to them each week. After the final car-free Sunday on 6 January 1974, many people nostalgically actually recall being able to roller skate on highways and the sudden peace in their neighborhoods. And this is kind of one of those images. There's a very famous photo series from the first car-free Sunday that this is also part of, and that's, I mean, there's always a drawback to using these kinds of images because they're also staging something. One of the important things about this picture is actually you can see a car driving here in the back, and also that if you wanted to go onto a highway, you really had to secure your place because actually they weren't empty by any means. There were a lot of people driving on them, and actually all these stories about being able to roller skate, it was actually quite dangerous to do that because there were quite a few people who had an exemption, and particularly as the Sundays repeated week after week, there were ever more people applying for exemptions. So one of the reasons why the government felt that fuel rationing was a better solution was that it was harder to apply for all kinds of exemptions, so that bureaucracy that wouldn't be overloaded. Anyway, but it also showed you how kind of this is something that people draw on as kind of to create an alternative imaginary, and that's exactly what happens shortly after, because just 3 months after the last car-free Sunday, the environmental action group Milieudefensie, which became the Dutch branch of Friends of the Earth, and the anti-car initiative Stop the Kindermoord, it's a very brutal name, Stop Child Murder, was an anti-car campaigning organization, launched the so-called Zonderdag without day campaign. It's also a pun on Sunday in Dutch. So it's and they framed the car-free Sunday as a symbolic action to curtail the car's negative effects rather than as a temporary. So it's no longer, for those initiatives, it's no longer a way to save fuel. And as a temporary measure, it's something that we should be doing at least every month to remind ourselves of the fact that we don't actually need cars and that a living environment without cars is a better environment. And the campaign attempted to collect enough signatures to show the government that there were enough people in the Netherlands who actually wanted a monthly car-free Sunday. Within about a month, the initiative collected almost 160,000 signatures. These were presented to Prime Minister Joop den Uyl the very same month, and he accepted them graciously, but already in his very gracious reply, was quite doubtful about the chance of car-free Sundays returning. And actually, his own Minister of Traffic had already said that this was not going to happen, and particularly using that argument about the number of exemptions that they would have to process at the bureaucratic level was very important to him. What did happen was something else. In a follow-up meeting with the Minister of Health and Environment, the campaign team secured the promise of a study on the viability of a car-free Sunday. Now, that is usually, of course, the way an idea dies, right? In a political protest situation. If the minister promises you, well, they'll write a report on it, that's usually the last thing we hear about it. But not in this case. The newly founded Bureau of Social and Cultural Planning was just 1 year old at that time, was tasked with the research for this report, and that bureau actually saw this as an excellent opportunity to demonstrate its capabilities, because it still had to prove itself in the government landscape of institutes. And so it wrote a very comprehensive report, which listed all the different measures, surveyed a wide range of options to reduce car use, and actually in that sense also reformulated it its own brief in saying what our goal is to reduce car use, and we're going to evaluate all kinds of different measures to achieve that. Now, from the perspective of Milieudefensie and Stop the Kindermoord, the conclusion was very disappointing, because the researchers concluded that a car-free Sunday was not a viable way to reduce car use. We can go into the reasons, but let's skip that for now. The report argued that it was much more promising to design neighborhoods to exclude cars or to make the use unattractive in the living environment of people. And the Bureau thus reinforced a growing view among Dutch spatial planners that cars should be removed from residential areas as much as possible. And this view was reflected in many new suburban development projects since. So the Netherlands really goes into a different kind of urban planning regime at the end of the 70s, where most residential areas are designed to either not have cars in them or have cars driving maximum 30, sometimes 15, to really kind of make sure that they're not that streets are not primarily there for cars since the 70s. By the middle of the 1970s, cars drew so much criticism in Dutch society that the Dutch car trade organization, BOVA, even deemed it necessary to launch a campaign to improve the image of the car. The Blij dat ik rij, I'm happy I'm driving campaign was launched and was actually quite, still resonates with a lot of people nowadays. Resistance to environmental politics can indeed sound quite innocuous. The Zonderdag campaign had foregrounded the well-being, which could be achieved by reducing car use. But politics of car use also continued to revolve around the question of resources. The Dutch government, after the oil crisis of 1973, continued to prioritize policies which would reduce the dependency on oil. Campaigns to convince citizens to use less energy could build on longer-standing traditions of promoting frugality in the face of mass consumption. And that idea of frugality in the face of mass consumption is really another issue that resonates, I think, with a lot of the longer histories of environmentalism. Attempts to limit car use were, in that sense, part of a broader push to curb consumption. And churches had been particularly preoccupied with the lifestyles of Christians in a post-colonial world since the 1960s, where many people in Western Europe started to live unprecedentedly prosperous lives. The World Council of Churches had spoken about the need to adjust the way people lived in light of unequal relations between the South and the North, and the pressure economic activities exerted on the environment in its assembly in 1966. Engagement on behalf of peace, justice, and equal distribution blended with a more conservative strain of criticism focusing on the moral emptiness of life in a technologically advanced consumer society. And those, I think, two different strains within the Assembly of Churches. They come together around this idea that consumption or mass consumption is at least doubtful or probably even bad, and that it should be reined in some ways. There's a very conservative strain and a very progressive one that can be joined in that idea. Conversations about consuming responsibly found their way from international gatherings to local and national church assemblies, signaling once again a remarkably broad consensus about the need to change the way people lived. The Dutch Catholics and mainland Protestant churches launched a campaign to promote a new lifestyle or a new style of living in 1973. A working group was tasked with mounting a campaign to this effect. The werkgroep Nieuwe Levensstijl, working group Nieuwe Lifestyle, distributed information and suggestions for activities to church members. And the image on the slide here is from the cover of one of the discussion guides that was published for the many local groups that took up that call. So this is once again something that a lot of different places, small and large in the Netherlands, local groups start to discuss and try to kind of work on. And the manual encourages readers to identify issues that tie reflection to concrete changes in the way they lived. Some of the suggestions were: eat less meat, heat home sparingly, and reduce the use of cars, of course. Did every household really need its own car, the authors asked? The consequences of consumer culture were visible all around, they argued. A lack of resources and energy, noise nuisance, degradation of the ecosystems, etc. All things that the car stood for. Moreover, the growth and prosperity in the global north had come at the cost of the global south, told its readers. Reducing consumption could have social benefits to boot, the manual continued, because sharing, and I quote, sharing may lead to more problems, but maybe to more community too. So there's, once again, but from a very different angle, the same, almost mirroring what the Witcar initiative was also doing at the same time in Amsterdam around cars. The campaign spurred the establishment of around 700 local groups, and that is about twice the number of local communities or local municipalities that we have in the Netherlands. So it's really a large number for such a small country. But an evaluation of the campaign published in 1981 noted that interest in participating in these groups was dwindling after about 5 years. Maybe the interest had been spurred by economic crisis, the report ventured. But conserving resources was certainly not a thing of the past by the early 1980s. In March 1980, one of my favorites, actually, het Stroomspaarspel, on the left, was aired on Dutch television. It's the energy quiz for the whole family. And the saving energy game is actually it's called. And during that show, public figures advised the viewers on ways to use energy more sparingly. Queen Beatrix's popular husband, Prince Claus von Amsberg, from behind his royal desk, confided that although he found it very challenging, driving less fast was a very effective way to save energy and money too. And he tells us, I mean, if you would have been able to understand Dutch, I would have brought you the fragments. It's very touching. The way he speaks, and also the kind of very much older form of political communication where somebody is actually sitting behind his desk and reading to his audience and trying to confide in him. Civic initiatives and government campaigns continue to promote economizing. New efforts to promote sustainable consumption in the 1980s prioritized changing patterns of consumption rather than transforming them comprehensively. So changing them kind of slightly is usually what people try to achieve in the 1980s rather than these more comprehensive changes of lifestyle. And the car remained a crucial leverage point for achieving that. The energy policy of the Dutch government during the 1970s and 80s stipulated that reducing private car use was an important way to decelerate growth of energy demand and decrease the dependency on oil. Mirroring the kind of civic initiatives of this time that we discussed. Energy policies strive to enhance efficiency, reduce the use of cars, and promote other sources of energy to drive them. Now, efficiency in the short run, I think, and this is one of the strange things here, the best way to do that, the best way they knew to do that was to install speed limits. In the Netherlands, speed limits were another consequence, actually, of the oil crisis in 1973. In 1974, they were officially set at 100 on highways. They had been kind of as emergency law been installed in 1973 around the oil crisis and then made permanent in 1974. 80 on other roads outside of residential areas. And civic initiatives had been advocating this measure well before the oil crisis to improve safety and reduce pollution. The concerns over energy availability enabled the realization of that idea. So there's once more actually a very kind of unexpected moment where that idea of limiting cars' speed by activists is then taken up under very specific conditions. Politicians and civic initiatives also emphasize the potential of public transport and using bicycles to substitute car use. And once again, civic groups promoting cycling were particularly successful, convincing planning officials and local governments to integrate cycling paths in their spatial planning designs. And since the 1970s, that of course means then that the Netherlands becomes one of these countries that really is seen as a model country for cycling traffic, where bicycles are granted the same rights as cars on roads. Public transportation was promoted by the national government since the 1980s by constructing park and ride sites at train and bus stations. And publicity campaigns and financial incentives were also a crucial means to stimulate Dutch citizens to reduce the use of cars and use other means of transportation. Finally, attempts were launched to use different sources of energy. Milieudefensie, the Friends of the Earth branch that we already discussed in 1997, launched the first campaign to advocate for solar energy. The energy the sun provided could be harnessed much more effectively than it was done at that time, it argued. The sun provided through warmth, wind, the growth of plants, biomass, the potential for collectors to generate heating and electricity, a lot of different opportunities. There was even a very adventurous plan to use sun rays through a parabolic mirror to smelt iron, which we've never heard of again, but the other ideas are actually quite practicable. Some of these ideas were taken very seriously by the Dutch government. Isolating houses to retain warmth was a very successful strategy to reduce energy use in the short term, and has been one of the staples of government intervention in countries like the Netherlands and others in terms of energy policy. There were important differences, though, between the reigning political parties and the activists. Milieudefensie wanted sustainable energy sources as a substitute for fossil fuels. Already by the 1970s, sees this as kind of the end game, is introduce alternative energy sources, then phase out fossil fuels. Oil companies and the national government regarded solar energy as a way to meet a growing energy demand. So just use it in addition to what we're already using. And in contrast to organizations like Milieudefensie and Greenpeace, subsequent Dutch governments saw nuclear energy as a viable option to reduce the dependency on oil, coal, and natural gas beyond solar energy. In relation to cars, substituting for oil was hardly considered during the 1980s and 1990s. And that is actually a history that we need to know more about, because actually we do know that there are enough models for electric cars, so for different kinds of combustion than gasoline by the 1980s. We've seen this with car over there, but this is an option that is not seriously considered, except for what we know now in agricultural, some agricultural sectors where forms of electric tractors are actually becoming quite popular in the 1980s. But the fact that although there is a search for kind of alternative energy sources, and although that is being debated quite intensively, the idea that cars could be switched from one engine to another was actually not taken up seriously in the 80s and 90s. National energy policy did promote, and that is the one kind of dumb thing, substitution that is discussed, and it's really baffling with hindsight, is promoting diesel over gasoline, because producing diesel was more efficient and diesel engines were cheap. Beyond that, producers were encouraged to sell efficient cars and consumers were advised to buy them. So there's this emphasis on technological innovation and promoting technological innovation to have more economic cars. And that gets us to the third subject of concern, pollution. Because the emissions that cars produced despite these aforementioned measures led to a series of new initiatives in the 1980s. And the first was directed at emissions contribution to acid rain. The Waldsterben became a crucial environmental concern in the early 1980s. It would provide a prime example of how environmental issues could effectively be addressed. Agreements on a European and a national level were quickly signed after the problem was identified and some of the causes were isolated. And so in relation to cars, these agreements aim to reduce the share of sulfur in fuels and to install cleaner engines, two things that could be quickly realized. And these measures also led to quick and notable improvements. These policies in the short term made it less crucial to reduce car traffic. The attempts in this regard had, by and large, failed during the 90s, so the attempts to reduce car traffic. Between 1980 and 1990, in the Netherlands, almost 1 million cars were added to the total number. The construction of highways also continued, but by the end of the 1980s, the car did come into view once again as a cause of carbon dioxide emissions, a very different kind of pollution that then becomes kind of the new problem. And around this issue of the car as a producer of carbon dioxide pollution, if I may, we can see how climate change was in part a continuation of a broader history of the Great Acceleration, but also in many ways marks an important shift in the trajectory of that Great Acceleration in the way it is contested. Impressed by the need to react to the threat of climate change, the Dutch environmental agencies pushed to step up policies in the field of energy conservation and mobility. So those are really the two fields in the 1980s. Dutch, and this is one of the things that we've been trying to uncover in my Amsterdam group. The Dutch ministries of traffic, energy, and the environment all say climate change is a problem. We need to do something about it. What can we do? And they identify energy policy and mobility policy as the two areas that they're going to push for. Because they can do that within the national framework, so they don't have to wait for international agreements. For a lot of the other things, of course, you have to wait until you find some kind of multilateral platform, but for these, you can really start pushing yourself. Very concretely, the government proposed to make using the car for work more expensive. And this proposal, however, and here we see a change, I think a real change in terms of how the policy of the environment play out. The proposal to make car use for work more expensive was voted down by the same Liberal Party to which the Minister of the Environment actually himself belonged. And this is actually then leads to the fall of the whole government that proposes these environmental measures. And in that sense, the Dutch government might have to claim to be the first government to have to step down over a climate policy in 1988. Despite widespread concern about the adverse effect of car measures, which would make their use more expensive, would continue to be highly contentious in the years that followed. And this is one of the points where I really see a change in the dynamics that people start to realize that climate policies will cost money that we won't be able to recover in the same way that was mostly possible in the 1980s by simply making cars more efficient, more economic. Then the discussion really changes. This was one example of the growing tensions in the field of environmental politics around the turn of the 1990s. This tension was caused by mounting environmental pressures. The ongoing expansion of production and consumption has aggravated the pressure on the known environmental issues, as was clear from the fact that government agencies started to take serious the idea that instead of only adjustments, a different direction in mobility policies was actually warranted. The tension was heightened by the new problem of climate change. But we should not draw a straight line from heightening tensions to the recurrent fault lines in the politics of the Anthropocene. This was evident around the periodic revivals of the Car-Free Sunday since the 1990s. Civic initiatives and municipalities continue to promote this idea of a Car-Free Sunday for a variety of reasons since during the 1990s and 2000s. Energy conservation was often still mentioned as one reason to do this. So just use a little bit less energy. Safety, promoting safety, promoting the idea that living environments can be safer. Well-being in terms of quietness and kind of having the street for other purposes. A sense of community and even environmental justice comes into play as an element. What they had in common, all these initiatives, was that they presented the car-free Sunday as a stepping stone towards reducing car use altogether. So as a kind of a measure that has to lead up to something bigger. Now, I want to take a very small detour to present something about this kind of the unexpected ways in which, since the 1990s, these environmental tensions play out, because the new dynamics of the great acceleration after the so-called discovery of global warming were most evident around discussions over energy futures. Civic groups, government agencies, and energy companies pushed to introduce alternative sources of energy like solar energy, and they step up that push in the 1990s when they realized that climate change is a big problem. So there is no straight line from kind of this problem of climate change to a confrontation between fossil fuel companies and environmental activists, as this small story, I think, can very aptly demonstrate. Because during the 1990s, Greenpeace, to this end of promoting alternative energy, explored opportunities to collaborate with businesses, even with its arch enemy Shell. And this is particularly remarkable in the Netherlands, where Shell is kind of next to Albert Heijn in food policies, is the big enemy of the Greenpeace activists, but not in the 1990s. That actually changes in the second half of the 1990s. Because since 1994, Greenpeace International actively explored ways to promote the installation of solar panels in collaboration with different companies who were investing in solar energy. Now, in the Netherlands, that led to the so-called Solaris campaign that aimed to persuade consumers to install solar panels on the roof of their private homes and try to offer them for a particularly attractive price. And Greenpeace hoped that a demonstration of the affordability and the viability of solar panels for private use could force a breakthrough in their adoption. To achieve this, Greenpeace was even willing to collaborate with Shell as a provider of solar panels, as that company was ambitiously investing in its solar energy operations right around that same time. So it built two huge new solar panel factories in Gelsenkirchen and in Helmond in the Netherlands. And Greenpeace realized that this might be a moment where they actually need to start collaborating. Shell actually also wants to, of course. Greenpeace would not be Greenpeace now if the campaign was not accompanied by publicity stunts. To draw attention to the campaign, Greenpeace representatives turned up at the house of the Minister of Economic Affairs, which is over here. I actually think this is Diederik Samson who led the European Green Deal for Frans Timmermans afterwards. He was a Greenpeace activist around that.
That's him?
Yeah, I think it is him. He was one of the heads, and this looks like him with the hair. So you have to, still has hair in the He's one of the main spokesperson for Greenpeace around this campaign, and it's really a very interesting trajectory from being a Greenpeace campaigner for renewable energy, then being a Labour member in the Dutch Parliament, and then becoming kind of lead campaign man for Frans Timmermans around the European Green Deal. It's a story in itself. So they turn up at the house of this is the Minister of Economic Affairs, and offer him to install solar panels on his roof for, I think, even for free, but he refuses. Tellingly, the Minister for Health and Environment actually accepts, and this is something that goes back to a tension in Dutch politics, which seems to be recurring around energy policies. The Economic Affairs doesn't like usually initiatives that threaten fossil fuel interests. And then they go on in 2000 to install solar panels illegally on the office of the Prime Minister in The Hague at the National Parliament. So they actually do this is even more spectacular in a way. And you can actually see that this is also really framed as a climate change campaign, right? So in 2000, this is really very much seen as a climate change campaign. And also, once again, it's in English, so it's actually aiming at an international audience. Now, for cars, alternative sources. Let me not skip to that, because there's a final episode to this. The Minister of Economic Affairs' refusal to cooperate, notwithstanding, there was very little resistance actually broadly against this campaign. Which, I mean, otherwise you don't get to do this on the Prime Minister's office, right? I mean, if there's serious doubts about whether this is a good idea, then they wouldn't let you on the roof. But a couple of years into the campaign, it starts in 1988, a new fault line between Greenpeace and Shell came to the fore. Shell opted to double down on fossil fuels around the start of the 21st century. Around 2000, you can see kind of Shell reconsidering most of its portfolio in alternative energies. By 2006, they've kind of almost abandoned all of their operations. Although they're one of the fossil fuel companies that has a couple of those projects running up until today, but the main investment that it does actually are then sold by 2006. And at the same time, Greenpeace deemed the success of solar panels that this campaign achieved, and a couple of other campaigns in Europe as well, as proven up that a future without fossil fuels was possible and actually within reach. And that also changes Greenpeace's position vis-a-vis oil companies. Now, for cars, alternative sources of energy, and like I said, this is something that is interesting in itself, that it's not taken seriously, but it did not, in the eyes of both activists and government officials, provide solutions until the recent introduction of electric cars. And once again, it's interesting that the European Green Deal, with Dietrich Samson as one of its architects, really thinks that electric cars are a key to kind of moving away from fossil fuels, and there might be something to it actually in light of this. Because in this field, in the field of cars, environmental initiatives could, up until that time, only continue to push for reducing car use, with few new successes since the 1990s. And that gets me to my conclusion. I hope I'm doing okay for time.
Yeah.
Good. Because this is almost the final slide. This is actually to wrap up. So why should you bother about the history of cars in a very small corner of Europe? This so-called eco-duct near the Dutch town of Kootwijk at the highway A1 nicely sums up my argument. Cars have transformed the Netherlands as much as environmental initiatives have, right? This is a highway that is constructed to also facilitate the traveling through wildlife. It's actually one of the fact that we have these have been constructed in the Netherlands since the 1990s is one of the reasons that there's now wolves in the Netherlands, living in the Netherlands again, which is a huge issue right now in Dutch politics. Well, it's a nice subject for another time as well. Now, as I've shown, environmental initiatives achieve notable results in their attempts to slow down the great acceleration. Things like these eco-ducts. The one-sided transformation of landscapes was halted. There's still highways constructed, but they're much more nature inclusive, and there's much more attention to kind of limiting as much as possible the negative effects. The use of cars in the living environment of most Dutch citizens was seriously restrained. A more economic use of fuel was achieved through regulation and innovation, and car traffic became safer, cleaner, and quieter because of broadly shared concern about its environmental impacts. Redefining environmental politics can thus help to make sense of this impact. Environmental initiatives could achieve considerable results because they address elementary issues like health and access to resources. So most of the times it is successful, it addresses these very fundamental issues. And this approach to environmental politics forces us to move beyond pointing out who was for or against the environment. It has instead enabled me to demonstrate the widely shared concerns about the impact of the great acceleration and to take seriously the different approaches put forward to address them. Seen through this lens, Dutch society did not become a light green society, to once more borrow Michael Bess's phrase. It was a light green society, at least since the 1960s already. Even though environmental concerns were widely shared and acted upon, the great acceleration was not halted. The number of cars continued to increase. In 1939, just for context, in 1939, there was one car for every 100 Dutch citizens. In 1973, at the time of the first oil crisis, there was one car in every 5. So we go from 100 to 1 in 5. And now in 2023, which is the latest numbers I have, that number had risen once again to one car for every 2 Dutch citizens. So we go from 1 to 100 to 1 to 10 to 1 to 2 even, right? I mean, this is really an amazing number still. And I know people who don't have a car, so there must be, anyway, there must be people having 4. Similarly, energy consumption on the whole has continued to increase despite the widespread support for efficiency, diversification, and policies to address climate change. Against the background of the climate crisis, environmental initiatives could be dismissed as failures. If so, they can still tell us something about the roads not taken and to highlight the political nature of decisions which then willingly condoned detrimental environmental consequences. That would be a first way in which studying a resistance could be important. But my point is not that environmental initiatives have unwittingly abetted environmental degradation, although that may be true in some instances. This history shows us that attempts to challenge human relations to the environment were not simply futile or misguided. Understanding their impact is crucial to grasping our current moment, as this ecoduct reminds us. The attempts to curb car use highlight how successful resistance has shaped the Anthropocene as much as failures to resist it have. The Great Acceleration continued despite these successes, not because of them. Any explanations of its trajectory then should take their impact into account. People have been conscious of the problems this was causing right from the start, first and foremost in relation to the effects on their own living environments, but also in terms of its effects on other parts of the world and in the ways that this could come back to haunt them. Let's leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So please, questions, comments, suggestions, objections. What's that?
You can break the ice with a very general question. Thank you very much for your talk. And the first thing that struck me when you started is that we constantly have the impression that when we work on environmental awareness, that it's a very recent thing, and then you talk come along and it's like, oh my God, absolutely not. But it's not just not new; it's also not new in the topics, in the problems, and the way we talk about them, like the fact that you have people who are anti-cars already right after the Second World War. That's such a surprise. So I guess my question would be, first, how come that we don't know about this? Of course, now your work comes along, so we'll know more. But since you're working on it, you must know why we don't know anything about this up to now, and then what does it mean that we keep forgetting about these fights that are actually old?
Yeah, great question. Not very easy. So I think this idea of kind of expanding or enlarging the history of environmental consciousness is something that, for example, Jean-Baptiste Poisson has been working on as well, and I think is a really important part of kind of politicizing that history of the environment and saying this is not something that we only recently stumbled upon and now we'll solve it because we know about it, right? And to warn also in a political way, I think warn people that actually knowing that this problem is out there is not going to be enough to solve it. But that doesn't explain the second part of the question: why don't we know about it, right? And I think maybe some of this is due to the fact that one of the things that we struggle with in that project, kind of uncovering that environmental consciousness, is that what people conceptualize to be the environment and to be the main environmental problems is not stable. I think this is one of the things that we have to kind of historicize. And one of the things that maybe comes through in the way that I discussed this is that actually most of the earlier problems up until climate change were more or less, transformational landscape is hard because it's negotiated, quite successfully dealt with. So in a way, kind of that history, the history of acid rain, I mean, if you listen to experts, they'll say it's not, but for people, and even for environmental campaigns, by the 1990s, the acid rain problem is gone, right? And in that sense, that history ends there. And then there's a new history on contesting cars about carbon dioxide. So there might be something, I think, actually in that success that kind of a lot of these campaigns feel resolved. It's also something that you encounter beyond just environmental histories, I think in social movements a lot anyway. And there is a way, of course, in which social movements or any kind of civic initiative is much harder pressed to have a longer term historical consciousness because they don't have the same means as states or other organizations have to memorialize their opportunity. And there's a way in which it's often not that important because they're right in the middle and don't have the resources to think about the past a lot. And there's even a strategic way in which it might not be helpful for environmental organizations now to say we've been trying to do this for 50 years. I often actually also in discussions with younger activists when we talk about these kinds of projects, you also get a sense that to an extent it would be better if this history starts now, right? Because that is is a kind of a more motivating idea that we're going to do this now than and that actually older if anything has happened in the past it hasn't been successful, we don't have to think about it anymore. And so there's also a way in which this is not a history that I think social movements sometimes think they need. So there's not much I have to think about for whom I'm actually writing this, right? But there, I think is part of the answer that also, for example, in Fairtrade history, you come across this idea that actually the past isn't that important to what we're doing, or might even be detrimental to our project in a way if we make it too important.
Yes, I would like to take that up, and you kind of mentioned it already, but not explicitly, and that is a lot of the movements, they worked on technical solutions like the solar panels, while others worked more on a social solution, the car-free Sunday. And I think especially back then, it was still easy to have a technical solution to the problem, make the car smaller, have electric cars, whatever. But at this point in time, we need change and much greater change, much quicker than back then. So I think that in some sense, I believe you need also a social transformation.
Yeah.
Which brings me also to a question that I have, and I understand you were talking about the Netherlands, a small country, but throughout the history, do you believe there's a difference between the urban and the rural areas, especially when it comes to the question of car use and adaptation?
It's two really good questions. Let's start with the last one because that's, I think, is the easier one. Because the interesting thing is that, for example, around 1973, car-free Sundays, they did research among urban and rural populations. They didn't find any differences in the Netherlands. Now, I think the Netherlands might be a little bit different than some countries because I think the differences between residential areas and the countryside aren't as big as in some other parts. What you do notice, of course, and there's a difference that is sometimes hard for us to conceptualize because it's changed, I think, since the 1970s, in part because of what I've been talking about, is that in the 1970s, the argument is still that actually the rural population might be better off on a car-free Sunday because they have kind of their leisure area out there. I mean, where the pushback is usually is people who want to go to church and say, well, my church is 20 kilometers away. I can't do that on bike, and particularly not with my sick grandmother or something. So there's in the rural areas, that's the kind of argument. But the Social Democrats, for example, who actually vote down this idea of bringing them back, say this is a problem for the working classes in the cities because they depend on their cars to go out of the city on the weekend. And that is something that I think if you do the same now, and if I look at, I've been starting to work on analyzing the much more recent histories of car-free Sundays, it's not an argument that comes up anymore because cities have really been transformed to make sure that there's more leisure areas for people in their own area, so that it's not people in cities don't depend on their car to get out of the city. Well, we could, but I mean, you don't have to. It's not in the same kind of. So that I think is in a way less relevant than you might think, but it does change arguments. So for rural populations, the arguments about being allowed to use your car or not, and why that is a problem, are different to an extent to residential or urban areas. Your first question was about the social and technical. Yeah, it's a really nice and a really important subject. But one where I think it's hard to conceptualize them straightforward as this is a technological and this is a social solution, because, and I think the Greenpeace campaign is the perfect example, because Greenpeace sees technological innovation as a necessary part of a larger social transformation. Whereas when the Dutch government in the 1980s says, can we have cleaner cars, please, because acid rain is a problem, they're not thinking, or at least not in that policy thinking about it. So there is no kind of straight division between, is a technological innovation only that, or is it part of something of a larger program? I think it is, and that's why I'm going to kind of almost contradict myself, or maybe full out contradict myself. It is the reason why technological innovation is particularly vulnerable as an activist strategy, because you can very easily draw other groups into that, but it's very hard to maintain that vision of this actually has to lead up to a larger social transformation. But I mean, particularly around solar energy and then kind of the electrification of the household through solar energy, and now kind of the opportunity that then also offers people to, for example, have an electric car and charge it much more cheaply. It actually might, in a way, make the divorcing of consumers and the fossil fuel industry a lot easier if this plays out in that way. So in a way, Greenpeace might 30 years after actually become kind of vindicated in that sense, right? And we don't really know how that plays out. And it is quite obvious that that technological innovation has to take place before you can even think about unsettling a fossil fuel industry. So in that sense, yes and no.
We're talking here about, as you know, about catastrophic learning, like learning from natural disasters and man-made catastrophes. Is it possible at all? Like how people do it? What is the kind of the political framework or implications in this process? And the Netherlands, of course, is a fantastic example because it has this age-long experience of catastrophic learning, adjustment to floods and other man-made catastrophes, even though the Dutch people probably they didn't realize that they were man-made, that those floods were also man-made, but now we know much more about this. But one thing that just came to my mind, that exactly because, so one take on this, that, okay, so that there is this historical experience, tradition of fighting these catastrophes, and that should accelerate or facilitate this catastrophic learning. But on the other hand, like precisely because there is such a technical sophistication and reliance on these technical solutions, dikes, dams, etc., pumps. So maybe actually this technical experience prevents the further kind of or kind of shifts the learning process into this technical way.
I think it's right in the middle. I think the technological solutions are the primary form of catastrophic learning in the instance of flood control. So most of the large dam and dike construction projects are developed, even going back to the 19th century, actually, as responses to catastrophic floodings, right? I mean, and that is usually the moment. So for the Zuiderzeewerk that I mentioned here is a really interesting, because that plan had been in a drawer since the late 19th century. And it had never really gained any traction among political elites until the big flood of 1917. And it combines with, and that's another almost catastrophic event. Well, it's a catastrophic event with the First World War lack of food in the Netherlands, because it becomes cut off of a lot of international supply chains that it is part of. And so then all of a sudden that same idea that for almost 20 years hadn't gained much traction becomes very attractive, because it solves two problems that were kind of induced by two catastrophes at the same time. It solves the flooding problem for the whole kind of area that borders that Zuiderzee, and it creates additional agricultural land to make sure that the country is actually less dependent on imports for food. So their technological innovation becomes, I think, the kind of the primary, and it's very similar to what happens with the last large floodings in 1953. That is the moment where a national Delta plan is it's called actually a plan for securing the whole Dutch coast against any catastrophic flooding that was redeveloped actually since 2010 as a climate adaptation program as well. It's also an event where kind of the catastrophe leads at least to a narrative of technological learning. To an extent, it's just the activation of technological knowledge that was already there. In some instances, they need new technologies as they try to actually realize those visions. So, and then in a way, I think by promoting the technological learning, you also can almost ignore, and this comes back to your question a little bit, ignore any other potential learnings that you'd have. So by saying we can simply build higher dikes, you don't have to think about climate mitigation in the most recent instance, or earlier, if you can develop an ecoduct. You don't have to think about whether it's actually a good idea to build a highway in the middle of one of the few valuable natural areas that is still around, right? I mean, in a way, technological learning substitutes for other forms of learning, and is in a way the road of least resistance, I suppose. Yeah.
Anything else?
Yeah.
Really quickly, like during, especially like from the 70s onwards with the adaptation, obviously trying to like lessen automobiles, of course, like the introduction of cycling and whatnot. I guess like from that point onwards, did Shell make concerted efforts to try and influence politics and policy?
No, there's so much not from that moment onward, but already from the I have one extra slide that I didn't want to talk about, but now I have to, I think. These are two demonstrations against fossil fuel extraction. The one is Extinction Rebellion that has been taking place since 2022 in The Hague against fossil subsidies. So the idea that the government is actually giving all kinds of tax cuts to fossil fuel companies. And the right is the Groninger Bodembeweging, which is a protest against the extraction of natural gas in Groningen. And interestingly enough, both have been very long, have not had any success at all. Well, Extinction Rebellion since 2019 had very little resonance, and then 2022 when they started to talk about fossil subsidies as a kind of new category, they were very successful. And the Bodembeweging similarly had very little traction until 2020. And in both instances, they criticize a very, very long tradition of Dutch collaboration between the Dutch government and oil companies, particularly Shell. And one of our PhDs is doing research now that actually shows that this goes back to the colonial extraction of oil, where actually the first time this idea is practiced, that actually you kind of build a public-private partnership, as we would call it since the 2000s, to extract fossil fuels. And that is exactly what happens in the Netherlands outwards. And it really also leads to the idea that the interests of Shell, and particularly Shell, but also some of the other oil companies and the Dutch government are almost the same. And in many instances they are, because I mean, the Dutch government and Shell are both making their money from the Groningen gas extraction. So they both have very good reasons to ignore the earthquakes that it's causing and the danger that it's causing to the people living there. And in both instances, kind of the leverage point seems to be driving a wedge between the government and the fossil fuel companies, and that becomes possible in the Extinction Rebellion campaign by pointing out that they're actually being subsidized, which is something that is absolutely a no-go in the kind of late neoliberal stages that we are in, right? And in combination with climate policies then, or climate need for climate action. In the case of the Groningen protest is even more interesting because the cost of reparations and precautionary measures was becoming that high that the oil companies were trying to back out, and that the Dutch government then, of course, kind of felt left out in the cold with the cost, and that it was even a question of liability, who's actually liable if they continue and if anything bad happened. So that in both instances, then kind of there was. And it was a very singular moment, it's actually quite a singular moment in Dutch history in the 20th, 21st century, where fossil fuel companies and Dutch government national interests don't overlap anymore, and these protests managed to kind of find to strike a wedge between those two. So in that sense, it's I think part of a much longer history, and it's actually one of the interesting kind of side stories that I haven't developed fully. I think to that Solaris project that we were discussing is that the Dutch government is very, very open to that project and to supporting it because Shell is also involved. I think if it's only Greenpeace, it would have been much harder, but with Shell on board, it becomes much easier to get subsidies.
Frans Timmermans with this Dutch-made solar panel, that was a wonderful slide. So he resigned just a week ago, right? Finally, like he left.
And it's Diederik Samson. Frans Timmermans is Diederik Samson is his right-hand man. Frans Timmermans resigned. Diederik Samson is his right-hand man.
Okay, so that on the photo.
Yeah.
So that was
not Timmermans. No.
That's not. I got it.
No.
So that's not Frans.
No, it's his right-hand
his
campaign manager. Yeah. But not in the last 5 years in the Netherlands. But yeah.
Yeah, but that's okay. Great to know, because we're kind of here for some reason, political reason. We're really interested in John is going to interview him somehow.
We'll find him somewhere.
Timmermans.
Yeah.
Should be so hard.
Because we believe that
Right
now
now,
he has free time.
Unemployed, no?
Yeah, he's in Maastricht probably, right?
Okay.
He lost the elections and he resigned. So
Yeah.
he's not the leader, not the party leader.
Yeah, he
So
resigned.
he should have free time for John.
Yes, yeah, he should be.
But my question was about this solar panel and this kind of political engagement, because that was the Dutch-made solar panel. So like Shell and whatever Dutch corporations could be truly invested and interested in that. Well, contemporary solar panels, obviously, they come from China.
Mm.
Like about 90% of solar panels in Europe, they come from China.
Yeah.
So there is no, and Europe cannot compete. In terms of the costs, etc. So there is no possible economic or financial interest coming from any corporation in this kind of technological development.
Yeah.
And how does it, because the Netherlands obviously is a technical advanced country, which has again lots of experience on these technical things. So with this advance of China, these ecological climate issues, they also become geopolitical issues. Is it discussed?
It's one of the reasons why Shell decides to double down on fossil fuels. I mean, they say in their estimations change from 1996 to 2002, where they say if China is continuing this way, we won't be able to.
China will.
Yeah, so then they have to. Then we have to double down on oil. And there is it's not really quite. I mean, it's hard. The hard thing about these kind of company histories, because it's most of the production sites that they sell off continue to operate. So it's not quite clear whether the business argument holds up, or if they really also just want out and try to find a stick. But they are talking about China by the early 2000s already as kind of, if this continues, solar panel production in Europe won't be.
Oh, okay.
And so there's both kind of in how serious we should take the business argument is not so easy to establish. And then also whether that's actually kind of a call towards the European Union to say protect the European solar panel production industry, or we will move out, or if it's already kind of a foregone conclusion is also not quite clear. Because that, of course, is kind of and I think Germany would be probably more interesting even because there this becomes a primary issue is this question of whether the government and then the European government should do more to protect the European solar panel energy and decides not to. So in that sense, it's also very clearly kind of a decision on behalf of Europe not to block out the Chinese solar panels, which is, with hindsight, very clever. But yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
my question, if I can have one last one, and sorry to going back to the topic of the car, but in a similar manner, my question would be, given that especially I mean, now more recently, the adaptation of the US automotive standards in Europe. But I believe still that in the Netherlands, that is one of the few countries in Europe that has the easiest adaptation and the most adaptation of American cars. Has that something to do with the political stance? Has that something to do with Shell being such a major player?
You mean the fact that there are a lot of American cars?
Yes, that it's among the easiest countries and the most the country that has the most adaptation, or taking an American pickup and then putting them on the tiny streets in Amsterdam.
Yeah. It's definitely not Shell, because Shell is a Dutch company for Dutch people, right? And I mean, and Esso is the kind of the English, the American version that then comes in. But if there's I think if there's a structural reason for that beyond kind of and then Ford, for example, is very early in the Netherlands and very aggressive in the market. It's mostly, I think, the fact that it's a transportation hub through Rotterdam that and also the Amsterdam harbor develops as a primary site for importing a lot of American and also Chinese goods, of course, then later on. But there's a lot of the European kind of material or products for the European markets arrive in Rotterdam and then the Amsterdam container port. So I think that might be the more likely reason. But that's just my educated guess, right? I mean, it's not. I wouldn't see how Shell would have promoted that. And
no, I was more thinking as they're doubling down on fossil energy.
It's a lot of fashion, I guess.
But it goes back once again. It's something that's not kind of a recent development, right? It's been that
it has been for a long time. I mean, they also have certain governmental fundings where you don't pay taxes on cars from America if they're over 3.5 tons and things like this. That
just didn't even know that. Yeah. Great. Should reconsider, but no.
Electric hump.
All right, I think we're done with our questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.